Chapter 9. What Lucy Saw. Susan and the two boys were bitterly tired with rowing before they rounded the last headland and began the final pull-up, Glasswater itself, and Lucy's head ached from the long hours of sun and glare on the water. Even Trumpkin longed for the voyage to be over. The seat on which he had sat to stare had been made for men, not dwarfs, and his feet did not reach to floorboards, and everyone knows how uncomfortable it is, even for 10 minutes. As they all grew more tired, their spirits fell. Up until now, the children had only been thinking of how to get to Caspian. Now they wondered what to do when they found him, and how a handful of dwarfs and woodland creatures could defeat an army of grown-up humans. Twilight was coming on as they rode slowly up the headwinds of Glasswater Creek, a twilight which deepened on the banks and drew closer together, and the overhanging trees began to almost meet overhead. It was very quiet here as the sound of the sea died away behind them. They could even hear the trickle of little streams that poured down from the forest into Glasswater. They went ashore at last, far too tired to attempt lighting a fire, and even a supper of apples, and most of them felt like they never wanted to see an apple again, seemed better than trying to catch or shoot anything. After a little silent munching, they all huddled down together in the moss and dead leaves between 4 large beech trees. Everyone except for Lucy went to sleep at once. Lucy, being far less tired, found it hard to get comfortable. Also, she had forgotten until now that all dwarfs snore, and she knew that one of the best ways of getting to sleep is to stop trying, so she opened her eyes, and through the gap in the bracken and branches, she could see a patch of water in the creek and the sky above it. Then, with a thrill of memory, she saw again all those years the bright Narnian stars. She had once known them better than the stars of her own world. Because a queen in Narnia, she had gone to bed much later than a child in England. And there they were. At least 3 of the summer constellations could be seen from where she lay. The ship, the hammer, and the leopard. Dear old leopard, she murmured to herself. Instead of getting drowsier, she was getting more awake, and with an odd nighttime dreamish kind of wakefulness. The creek was now growing brighter. She knew that the moon was on it, though she couldn't see the moon, and now she began to feel the whole forest coming awake herself. She hardly knew why she did it. She got up quickly and walked a little distance away from the bouvier. This is lovely, Lucy said to herself. It was cool and fresh. Delicious smells were floating everywhere. Somewhere close by, she heard the twitter of a nightingale begin to sing, stopping and then beginning again. It was a little lighter ahead. She went forward, and the light came to a place where there were fewer trees. The whole patches are pools of moonlight, but moonlight and the shadows mixed. You could hardly be sure where anything was or what it was. At the same moment, the nightingale, satisfied with the last of his tuning up, burst into full song. Lucy's eyes began to grow accustomed to the light. She saw the trees that were nearest her more distinctly. A great longing for old days when the trees could talk in Narnia came over her. She knew exactly how each of these trees would talk, only if she could wake them, and what sort of human form it would put on. She looked at a silver birch. It would have a soft, showery voice and would look like a slender girl. Brown hair, or hair blown all around her face, fond of dancing. She looked at the oak. He would be a wizened but hearty old man with frizzled beard and warts on his face and hands and hair growing out of the warts. She looked at the beech tree under which she was standing. Ah, she would be the best of all. She would be gracious, smooth, stately, the lady of the wood. Oh, trees, trees, said Lucy, although she had not been intending to speak at all. Oh, trees, wake up, don't you remember it? Don't you remember me? Dryads, hammer dryads, come out to me. There was nothing but a breath as they all stirred about her. The rustling noise of the leaves was almost like words. The nightingale stopped listening as if to listen to it. Lucy felt at any moment she'd begin to understand what the trees were trying to say, but the moment did not come. The rustling died away. The nightingale resumed its song. Even in the moonlight, the wood looked ordinary again. Lucy had the feeling, as sometimes you have when you're trying to remember a name or a date and almost get to it, but it vanishes before you really do, that she had just missed something. If she had spoken to the trees a split second too soon or a split second too late, or used all the right words except for one, or put in one word that was just wrong. Quite suddenly, she began to feel tired. She went back to Bouvier and snuggled down between Susan and Peter and was asleep in a few minutes. It was a cold and cheerless waking for them all the next morning. The gray twilight in the wood, for the sun had not yet risen. Everything was damp and dirty. Apples, hi-ho, said Trumpkin with a rueful grin. I must say your ancient kings and queens don't overfeed your friends. They stood up and shook themselves and looked about. The trees were thick and they could see no more than a few yards in any direction. I suppose your majesties know the way all right? I don't. I've never seen these woods before in my life. In fact, I thought all along that we ought to have gone by the river. Then I think you should have said that at the time, said Peter, with pardonable sharpness. Oh, don't take any notice of her. She's always wet blanket, said Edmund. You've got that pocket compass of yours, Peter, haven't you? Well, then you're as right as rain. We've only got to keep going northwest, across that little river. What do you call it, the Rush? Oh, I know, the one that joins the big river at the fords of Byrna, or Byrna's Bridge, as the DLF calls it. That's right, cross it, strike uphill, and we'll be at the stone table, Aslan's how, I mean, by 8 or 9 o'clock. I hope King Caspian will give us a good breakfast. I hope you're right, said Susan. I can't remember all of that. That's the worst part of girls, said Edmund to Peter and the dwarf. They never carry a map around in their heads. That's because our heads have something in them, said Lucy. At first, things seemed to be going pretty well. Even then, they ought to have struck an old path. But if you know anything about woods, you know that one is always finding imaginary paths. They disappear after about 5 minutes, and then you think you found another one, and hope it's not another one, but more of the same one, and it also disappears. And after you've been well lured out of your right direction, you realize that none of them were paths at all. The boys and the dwarfs, however, were used to woods and were not taken in for more than a few seconds. They plodded on for about a half an hour, 3 of them very stiff from yesterday's rowing, when Trumpkin suddenly whispered, "Stop! There's something follow us. Or rather, something keeping up with us over there on the left." They all stood still, listening and staring, till their ears ached. "You and I'd better each have a bow on the string," Susan said to Trumpkin. The dwarf nodded, and both bows were ready for action. The party went on. They went a few dozen yards, thoroughly open woodland, keeping a sharp lookout. They came to a place where the undergrowth thickened, and they had to pass near to it. Just as they were passing the place, there came a sudden snarl that flashed, rising out of the breaking twigs in thunderbolt. Lucy was knocked down, winded, hearing the twang of a bowstring as she fell. When she was able to take notice of things again, she saw a great grim-looking gray bear lying dead, with Trumpkin's barrow in its thing. "The DLF beat you in that shooting match, Sue," said Peter, with a slightly forced smile. Even he had been shaken by this adventure. "I left it too late. I was afraid it might be, one of our kind of bears, a talking bear." She hated killing things. "That's the trouble of it," said Trumpkin. "When most of the beasts have gone enemy and gone dumb, you know that there are still the other kind left. You never know, but you don't want to wait and see." "Poor old bear. You don't think he was?" "No, I saw the face and I heard the snarl. He only wanted little girl for his breakfast. And talking of breakfast, I didn't want to discourage your majesties when you said you hoped King Caspian would give you a good one, but meat's a precious scarce in camp, and there's none good eating bear. It would be a shame to leave the carcass without taking a little meat, and it won't delay us more than a half hour. I say, you two youngsters, kings, I should say, know how to skin a bear?" "Let's go sit down a far way off," said Susan to Lucy. "I know what a horrid, messy business this is." And when they had sat down, such a horrible idea has come into my head, Sue. What's that? Wouldn't it be dreadful if some day in our own world, at home, men started going wild inside like the animals here? They still looked like men, but you never know which were which. "We've got enough to bother about here now in Narnia," said the practical Susan, without imagining things like that. When they rejoined the boys, the dwarf, as much as they thought could carry the best of meat, had been cut off. Raw meat is not a nice thing to fill one's pockets with, but they folded it up in fresh leaves and made the best of it. They were all experienced enough to know that they would feel quite differently about these squashy and unpleasant parcels of meat when they had walked long enough to be really hungry. On they trudged, stopping to wash 3 pairs of hands that needed it in the first stream they passed, until the sun rose and the birds began to sing. More flies than they wanted were buzzing in the bracken. The stiffness from yesterday's rowing began to wear off. Everyone's spirits rose. The sun grew warmer, and they took their helmets off and carried them. "I suppose we are going the right direction," asked Edmund about an hour later. "I don't see how we can go wrong as long as we don't bear too much to the left," said Peter. "If we bear too much for the right, the worst that can happen is wasting a little time by striking off the great river too soon and not cutting it off the corner." They trudged again with no sound except the thud on their feet and the jingle in their changed shirts. "What's this belly rash got to?" said Edmund. "I certainly thought we'd have struck it by now, but there's nothing to do but keep on." They both knew the dwarf was looking anxiously at them, but he said nothing. They all trudged. Their mail shirts began to feel hot and heavy. "What on earth?" Peter said suddenly. They had come, without seeing it, almost to the edge of a small precipice, from which they looked down the gorge at the bottom of the river. On the far right side, the cliffs rose much higher. None of the party, except Edmund and perhaps Trumpkin, was a rock climber. "I'm sorry, it's my fault for coming this way. We're lost. I've never seen this place before in my life." The dwarf gave a low whistle between his teeth. "Oh, let's go back and go the other way. I knew all along we'd get lost in these woods." "Susan, don't nag at Peter like that," said Lucy. "It's so rotten. He's doing the best he can." "And don't snap at Sue like that either," said Edmund. "I think she's quite right." "Tubs and tortoise shells," exclaimed Trumpkin. "If we got lost coming, what's the chance we have to finding our way back? And if we're to go back to the island, begin all over again, even supposing we could, we might as well give up the whole thing. Bears would have finished Caspian off before we got there." "You think we ought to go on?" "I'm not sure the High King is lost," said Trumpkin. "What's to hinder this river from being the Rush?" "Because the Rush is not a gorge," said Peter, keeping his temper with some difficulty. "Your Majesty says is." But what you say was, you knew this country hundreds, maybe 1,000 years ago. Couldn't have changed. A landslide might have pulled off half that side of the hill, leaving bare rock, and there you are, precipices beyond the gorge. Then the rush might go on deepening, of course, year after year, till you get a little precipice on this side, or there might have been an earthquake or anything. I never thought of that. And anyway, even if it's not the rush, it's flowing roughly north, so it must fall into the Great River anyway. I think I passed something that might have been it on my way down. So if we go downstream to our right, we'll hit the Great River. Perhaps not as high as we'd hoped, but at least we'll be no worse off than if you'd come my way. Trumpkin, you're a brick. Come on then, down the side of the river. Look, look, cried Lucy. What, where? The lion. Aslan himself, didn't you see? Her face had changed completely. Her eyes shone. Do you really mean? Where do you think you saw him? Asked Susan. Don't talk like a grown-up. I didn't think I saw him. I saw him. Where, Lou? Said Peter. Right up there between those mountain ashes. No, this side of the gorge, and up, not down, just the opposite way if you want to go. He wanted us to go where he was, up there. How do you know that's what he wanted? I just know by his face. The others all looked in puzzled silence. Her Majesty may as well have seen a lion. There are lions in these woods, I've been told, but it needn't have been a friendly lion or a talking lion any more than that bear was a friendly or talking bear. Oh, don't be stupid. Do you not think I know Aslan when I see him? He'd be a pretty old lion by now, said Trumpkin, if he's the one you knew when you were here before, and it could be the same one. What's to prevent him from having gone wild and witless like so many of the other creatures? Lucy turned crimson, and I think she would have flown at Trumpkin if Peter had not laid his hand on her arm. The elf doesn't understand. How could he? You must just take it, Trumpkin, that we really do know about Aslan. A little bit about him, I mean, and you mustn't talk about him like that again. It isn't lucky for one thing, and it's all nonsense for another. The only question was if Aslan was really there. I know he was, said Lucy, her eyes filling with tears. Yes, Lou, but we don't. Do you see, said Peter. There's nothing for it but a vote, said Edmund. All right, replied Peter, you're the eldest DLF. What do you vote for, up or down? Down, said the dwarf. I know nothing about Aslan, but I do know if we turn left and follow the gorge up, it might lead us all day before we found a place we could cross it, whereas if we turn right and go down, we're bound to reach the Great River in a couple hours. If there are any real lions about, I don't want to go towards them. I want to go away from them. What do you say, Susan? Don't be angry, Lou, said Susan, but I do think we should go down. I'm very tired. Let's get out of this wretched wood and open as quick as we can, and none of us except you saw anything. Edmund, asked Peter. Well, there's just this, speaking quickly and turning a little red. When we first discovered Narnia a year ago or 1,000 years ago, whichever it was Lucy who discovered it first, and none of us would believe her. I was the worst of it, I know, yet she was right after all. It wouldn't be fair to believe her this time. I vote for going up. Oh, Ed, said Lucy, and she squeezed his hand. And now it's your turn, Peter, said Susan, and I do hope... Oh, shut up, and let a chap think. And interrupted Peter, I'd rather much not have to vote. You're the High King, said Trumpkin sternly. Down. I know Lucy may be right after all, but it can't help it. We've got to do one or the other. So they left to their right along the edge, downstream, and Lucy came last of the party, crying bitterly.